Subscribers to this channel receive carefully researched ebooks, detailed videos showing real DIY woodworking projects being built step by step, and exclusive timber-related content that is not published publicly. The focus here is on material understanding, how wood actually behaves over time, and why older methods still matter when durability is the goal. Most people assume wood gets weaker with age, that it dries out, cracks, softens, and eventually fails unless it's sealed, treated, or replaced. That assumption is so common it rarely gets questioned. But archaeological timber from Viking structures, ships and tools keeps challenging it. In the right conditions, harvested and handled correctly, their wood didn't just survive, it improved. It became denser, more dimensionally stable, and more resistant to decay over time. That didn't happen by accident, and it wasn't because of some lost species of supertree. It was the result of a harvesting rule that modern forestry largely ignores. You know, what most people misunderstand about why old timber still performs is actually pretty fascinating. When folks see surviving Viking ships or structural timbers pulled from bogs and burial sites, they usually credit preservation conditions alone. Cold water, low oxygen, or burial environments get all the attention. Those factors certainly matter, but they don't explain everything. Many Viking timbers that survived weren't permanently submerged. Some were exposed to cycles of moisture and drying, yet, remarkably, they retained strength and shape far longer than modern equivalents. The missing piece is really how the tree was treated before it ever became timber. Modern lumber is harvested for speed and yield, while Viking-era timber was harvested for performance over time. That difference changes the internal structure of the wood in ways that don't show up immediately, but, compound over decades. The rule wasn't about cutting trees, but about timing them. The key rule was seasonal harvesting during deep dormancy, combined with deliberate stress exposure before final use. Trees were felled when sap content was at its lowest, typically in mid to late winter. This is often mentioned casually, but its importance is really underestimated. Sap isn't just moisture. It's actually a mix of sugars, starches, proteins and nutrients that decay organisms really thrive on. By harvesting when sap flow had fully retreated into the roots, Viking timber started its life with fewer internal food sources for fungi and bacteria. That alone improves durability. But they didn't stop there. So, leaving timber out in the open wasn't just some careless oversight. After trees were felled, the logs were, often deliberately left exposed to the wind, the cold, and a bit of moisture, rather than being milled or stored away right away. This really wasn't neglect at all. What they were doing was, in fact, controlled seasoning, putting the wood under a bit of stress on purpose. The interesting thing is, the outer layers of the wood would dry out, shrink and harden first, while the core stayed, a bit more flexible. This gradual differential drying encouraged the collapse of weaker early wood cells and tightened the late wood structure. Over time, this increased density and reduced internal movement. Modern kiln drying achieves speed, but it bypasses this structural adaptation. It locks in tension instead of allowing the wood to resolve it naturally. How this process made wood harder instead of brittle. Hardness in wood isn't just about dryness. It's about how cell walls respond to long-term stress. Viking-harvested timber experienced repeated freeze-thaw cycles, slow moisture loss and surface oxidation. These conditions promoted lignin stiffening and gradual crystallization of cellulose chains. The result was wood that resisted compression and abrasion better over time. Tool handles, ship planking and load-bearing beams benefited from this slow transformation. You know, modern lumber often reaches its peak mechanical stability shortly after drying, and then, well, it starts to degrade. Interestingly, Viking timber often did the opposite. So, why did straight grain matter more than species? There's a tendency, I think, to credit oak alone for Viking durability. Oak was important, sure, but it wasn't magic. Straight grain selection mattered just as much. Trees were chosen based on growth pattern, exposure to wind and slope. Trees that grew slowly under consistent stress produced tighter growth rings and more uniform fibre alignment. This wasn't aesthetic preference. Straight, even grain distributes stress predictably. When combined with winter harvesting and slow exposure seasoning, it reduced microfractures that become failure points decades later. How modern forestry works against this outcome. Today, trees are harvested year-round, often during active growth. Logs are processed quickly to prevent staining and checked for speed, not structural evolution. So, kiln drying actually forces moisture out before the wood has a chance to really adjust internally. The result? Well, you end up with lumber that looks stable, but in reality it carries a lot of locked-in stress. That stress, you know, it tends to show up later as things like warping, checking, joint failure, and even reduced load tolerance. Treatments and coatings, they do try to compensate for these issues, but honestly, they're only treating the symptoms, not the actual cause. The Viking approach, you know, actually reduced the need for intervention because the material itself was conditioned to survive. What archaeological failures teach us about the limits of the method is quite revealing. Not all Viking timber survived, after all. Where harvesting rules were ignored or storage conditions were wrong, decay, well, followed familiar patterns. Timber cut during high sap flow decayed faster even in cold conditions. Logs stored in stagnant moisture without airflow softened and lost strength. These failures reinforce the principle rather than undermine it. The method worked when all parts of the system were respected: timing, exposure, and use. It wasn't superstition. It was empirical knowledge refined through loss and repair. So, why does this really matter for modern woodworkers and builders? Well, understanding this rule honestly changes how you think about wood selection and handling. Even if you're buying modern lumber, being aware of the growth season, the drying method, and the exposure history, it really helps you predict long-term behavior. It explains why reclaimed timber often outperforms new stock, and why, some beams seem to improve with age, while others, well, they just deteriorate. For survival-minded builders, this knowledge matters even more. Structures meant to last without constant maintenance depend on material stability, not chemical protection. The Viking approach was about aligning with natural processes rather than overriding them. What this reveals about wood as a living material. Wood doesn't stop changing when the tree is cut. It continues responding to environment, stress and time. The Viking harvesting rule acknowledged that reality instead of fighting it. By guiding how wood transitioned from living tree to working material, they allowed it to settle into a stronger state. Modern practices often interrupt that transition. Speed replaces patience, and predictability replaces resilience. The result is wood that performs well on paper, but poorly over generations. Why this knowledge still deserves attention. This isn't about romanticizing the past. It's about, recognizing patterns that still apply. Timber harvested with respect for seasonal cycles and conditioned through exposure behaves differently. It ages differently. And in some cases, it improves rather than declines. Understanding that changes how you build, how you choose materials, and how you judge longevity. It reminds us that durability is often designed before the first cut is made. If this kind of material-focused, historically grounded knowledge matters to you, consider subscribing to the Old World Timber email list. These insights exist to help woodworkers, builders and historians understand not just how wood is used, but how it endures.